Hello, I'm Sheryl McCarthy. Welcome to One to One. During his 28 years on the Supreme Court, Justice Clarence Thomas has been painted as a jurist who is hard to understand, a man of moderate intellect who harbors bitterness over his controversial confirmation, who rarely participates during oral arguments, and harbors extremely conservative political views, especially given his race. In the Enigma of Clarence Thomas, however, Corey Robin, professor of political science at Brooklyn College and the CUNY Graduate Center, paints a far more complex picture of the court's second Black justice. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So what prompted you to write a book about Clarence Thomas?
Well, two things. The first was that I had stumbled across his past, which is not very well known. He was a black nationalist activist on the left in his younger years. And I began to see a lot of residue and persistence of those earlier beliefs in his court opinions. And this was a story that it seemed very clear to me has not really been told. And then the second thing is that in recent years, Thomas has become a much, much more powerful figure on the court and is arguably today the most powerful African American in the United States. And again, I feel like there was just not very much that's known about this person, what he actually believes.
In fact, Clarence Thomas has authored more than 700 opinions. His views are being followed by a majority of the court in many cases. His clerks have gone on to hold high-level positions in the Trump administration and on the federal bench. Do you think he's in line to become one of the most influential justices in the court's history?
I mean, I don't think there's any question about that. Many of the positions that are now majority of positions of the court were initially only Clarence Thomas's positions. So for instance, the idea that the right to possess guns is a personal right that individuals have. This is a very recent argument that the court has made. Clarence Thomas was the first person on the modern court to make that argument. And you can trace over and over again that kind of pattern. And now particularly with the appointments of Neil Gorsuch, and Brett Kavanaugh, there's a 5-person majority on the court that's ready to go in line with Thomas's opinions.
And you say he's written a lot of opinions.
A lot of opinions, and I've read them, and many of them very long is the other thing. For a justice who seldom, if ever, speaks during oral argument, he can be quite voluble in his opinions.
Why do you think there's this public perception that doesn't make a great contribution to the court?
Well, I think there's a couple of reasons, but I think we can't escape the fact that there's a certain kind of racism that's applied to him. One of the things I discovered in the course of researching this book is many of the accusations that are made against Clarence Thomas were actually also made against Thurgood Marshall, sometimes by white liberals. And so there's a kind of a double standard, I think, that is very hard to escape when it comes to African American justices on the Supreme Court.
A lot of people wonder how someone who grew up Black and relatively poor in the Jim Crow South could grow up to harbor such conservative political views. But you suggest that the prejudice Thomas experienced at the hands of other Blacks probably shaped him as much as the racism he experienced from whites.
There's no doubt that the first experience of the color line, I should say Thomas was born in 1948 in Pinpoint, Georgia, which is right on the Atlantic shore, not far from Savannah. And his first contact with the color line, his first real experience of it, not as an abstraction, was with other African Americans. Thomas was from a very poor background, and he's very dark-skinned. And he was mercilessly teased in the schoolyard, on the street, by other Black kids.
He also talked funny.
And that's another thing. You know, he spoke with the Gullah Geechee dialect that he had learned, as a very young child. So there was a variety of factors there, and in Thomas's head, they all came together as lighter-skinned African Americans tended to be more middle class. Their parents could be more professional. And also he would come to associate, I should say, all of that with Black African-American liberals. So people like Drew Days, who was the Solicitor General under Bill Clinton, or Patricia Harris, who was in Jimmy Carter's cabinet. For Thomas, the Black political establishment reminds him quite a bit of the kind of everyday teasing and jeering he
As the people
experienced.
who were making fun of him and
Yes.
looking down on him.
Yeah.
As a young black man in the 60s in college, he was in fact, you mentioned, a black nationalist. He used to wear in the Panther style, he wore
Yeah.
the black leather jacket and the beret. So what caused him to start moving to the right?
So I think it was a couple of things. Thomas goes to college in 1968. He heads north. And we forget that 1968, in the view of the Black freedom struggle, was really a moment of decline. That's the year that Martin Luther King is assassinated, Robert Kennedy is assassinated, Malcolm X has already been assassinated. And Thomas is politicized at a moment when, from the point of view of African Americans, they're losing. They had felt for a while that they were on the ascendancy, and now politically, they start losing. And I think that had a tremendous impact on him. And he comes to think all politics, whether it's more radical kinds of politics or mainstream kind of politics, voting and so forth, all politics is doomed for black people. And he says this very explicitly throughout the 1970s and 80s. The other side of it is that he reads Thomas Sowell, who's a very influential black economist, also very conservative, and he comes to believe that capitalism, the marketplace, might offer African Americans not a paradise, not salvation, but little niches, little spaces where they can accumulate wealth and resources that they can then redistribute to the black community.
This is sort of a throwback to Booker T. Washington and cast down your buckets where you are kind of thing?
Yes, there's definitely, in fact, he has a portrait of Booker T. Washington in his chambers. There's certainly a lot of parallels there. Thomas, I would say, is oddly enough much more pessimistic than Booker T. Washington was. He really sort of experienced this defeat of the civil rights movement, and I think there's a harder edge to his view. This is not very well known, but it's in all of his opinions. He believes, Thomas believes, that white racism, white supremacy, is an ineradicable fact of American life. It is not going away. You cannot defeat it by political means. And he thinks that part of the problem with the black political establishment and liberals in general is that they think you can address this through politics. So there's a real pessimism and a bleakness at the heart of his vision that I think almost transcends Booker T. Washington.
A bleakness that more political activity or political power by blacks can change much.
Yeah. In fact, he thinks can hardly change anything at all.
Was it seemed that when he was at Yale Law School that he turned against affirmative action, or that's where his feelings about affirmative action came to fore.
Yeah, I mean, he turns against it later, but you're absolutely right that at Yale Law School, he's brought in as a cohort, part of an affirmative action cohort of students of color, and he felt that he was consistently subjected to a double standard. And remember, this for him was a different experience from the kind of racism he had experienced in the South. He was used to the more overt, unabashed racism of white people that you could see in all the photographs of the civil rights movement in the South in the 1960s. That he was familiar with. He came to feel like the kind of racism he experienced at a place like Yale from white liberals was kind of, they give with one hand and take with the other. His favorite song at the time was the famous Smiling Faces Tell Lies. And that for him became paradigmatic of what white liberals were all about. They smile, they pretend that they're your ally and your friend, but in the end, they don't think particularly highly of you. And if you dare cross them, they will remind you that you are here because of us, and you ought to be grateful for us. And that was a very emblematic experience for him.
You write about the huge impact that his grandfather, Myers Anderson, had in shaping Thomas's legal philosophy.
Yeah, Myers Anderson raised him and was, talk about pull yourself up by your bootstraps, was really had brought himself up from very little and managed to become an independent businessman in Savannah. Extraordinarily hardworking and also very authoritarian. It was incredibly strict. And Thomas and he had a very contentious relationship when he was younger, but Thomas came to believe, and this is very important for his worldview in general, that it is stern black men like his grandfather who brook no opposition, who are very firm in the rules and very clear in the rules, these types of men upon whom the African Americans depend for their salvation. In fact, Thomas says, later point in his life, the salvation of the black race depends upon black men. And it's a particular type of black men. It's black patriarchal men. As I said, these very stern figures, almost out of the Bible, of authority, and very important for Thomas.
Seems to be a somewhat sexist view. I don't know. What do you think?
It's extraordinarily sexist. I mean, and what's even more significant is that he's completely unabashed about this. It is, I would say, what it really is a very patriarchal view.
Yeah.
Because he believes, it's not simply that he believes that black men are better than black women and the usual kinds of sexism and misogyny we might see. He believes the fate of the black community depends upon these black men, such that anybody who would tear them down is a real threat to the black community. And we'll get to this maybe later, but enter Anita Hill.
Before he was nominated to the Supreme Court, Thomas served as head of the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, under Ronald Reagan, correct? Where he seemed to try his best to subvert the mission of the agency.
Yeah, I mean, Thomas, as we've said, really believed that any effort on the part of the government, particularly the federal government, to improve the condition of black people would only make things worse. Was futile at best, but would actually do harm. And so he was a systematic opponent of the EEOC. But what was also interesting at the same time was he was very outspoken about the racism that he saw in the Reagan administration. So he occupies a very strange role, denouncing on the one hand the racism of the Reagan administration, on the other hand, as you say, really subverting the mission of the EEOC, and that's why, in part, he was such a darling of the right.
Of the right. We're going to take a short break. Then we'll be back with Corey Robin, professor of political science at Brooklyn College and the CUNY Graduate Center, and author of The Enigma of Clarence Thomas. Welcome back to One to One. I'm Sheryl McCarthy, and I'm talking with Corey Robin, political scientist and author of The Enigma of Clarence Thomas. Fast forward to the confirmation hearings. Thomas denounced the Anita Hill portion of those hearings as a high-tech lynching, but you're right that there was abundant evidence that he had sexually harassed Anita Hill.
Yeah. There's no doubt, I think most of the journalists who've investigated this have shown there's just too much corroboration that he sexually harassed Anita Hill and that he lied in the Senate confirmation hearings. I think the more interesting or ironic or complex aspect of that story is that quote that you cite when he said this is a high-tech lynching and the denunciations that he had. Also reflected something that he very much believes, and as I alluded to earlier, which is that the fate of the black community depends upon black men, like himself, like his grandfather, and that any effort to tear down black men will destroy the black community. And he views the liberal establishment and their allies as real threats to black men. And so what I say in the book is that in many ways that response he has to both Anita Hill and to the senators and the liberal groups that are making those accusations, he had been writing that story for a very long time in his own head, such that when the time came, even though he was completely surprised, I think, by the accusations, he was ready with his response because he had been rehearsing it for so long.
What do you consider the main elements of Thomas's judicial philosophy?
Well, I think the first, as we said earlier, is this pessimism about race and a firm belief that racism will continue and that racial conflict is permanent. And that's the bedrock of all of his opinions. What follows from that are two other principles that we've also mentioned. On the one hand, a belief that the government is not the friend of African Americans and in fact is oftentimes the enemy of African Americans. So for instance, his voting rights opinions are chilling because at the heart of those opinions is the belief that black people essentially shouldn't be voting. And
really?
It's a real, yeah.
At all?
At all. There's a real critique of black voting because he thinks it's a misbegotten enterprise. And that, I think, is part of the hostility that you see towards voting rights, which is very transparent. It's not hidden at all. So there's this real critique of the government and of political action, and then on the other hand, there's a real belief in the marketplace and in emancipating the market from the government. So I think those are two key components. And then the last component, which gets us into the third part of the book, despite his critique of the government and his opposition, he believes, and this I think is really the darkest, bleakest moment of his philosophy, that black men do best under conditions of adversity. That real constraints, you see a kind of heroic black patriarch rise forward like his grandfather. And so there is a belief that, Jim Crow was kind of a golden age for black people, which I think is something that is, that no justice on the Supreme Court would probably believes, and much less would ever say. Thomas has said it. And so I think when we get there, we start to understand some of his opinions on punishment, where he is very warm to what we call the carceral state, despite its racism.
And he certainly, he has refused to agree that the brutalization of black prison inmates by correction officers anything should be done about that.
Absolutely. And what's really shocking about those opinions is he does not deny that brutality. He embraces it. And at the heart of his willingness to say that these are horrible, horrible conditions, and again, you have to read the opinions just to see how horrible some of these conditions are, but the willingness to embrace it is this very dystopian view that punishment creates the conditions for a heroic black moral man to rise and help lift up the community. So it's, like I say, it's a very dystopian, bleak vision.
What about his opposition to abortion, or to Roe v. Wade at any rate?
Yeah, so this is something that came up after I had finished writing the book. I mean, he's written about his opposition to abortion in the past, but there was an opinion this last spring where he sees abortion and birth control as essentially a form of white eugenics. And he goes back and he looks at the origins of Planned Parenthood and so forth as a kind of white eugenic project to limit the size of the African American community. And again, people were very surprised when he put this into his opinion last spring, but it's very consistent with many of the arguments he's made over the years.
One thing that came up during the confirmation hearings was Clarence's supposed belief in natural law.
This was something that was very controversial. It got eclipsed by the Anita Hill charges. I tend to think that in the end it was an overblown controversy. Natural law doesn't really play very much of a role in his jurisprudence. So it was a flashpoint of argument, but I think it hasn't played much of a role on the court itself.
You devote 2 chapters to what you call Thomas's Black Constitution, and one to his White Constitution. And I have to say that you sort of lost me there. So, so explain to me what you mean by those.
Well, so constitutional law scholars generally talk about there being 2 constitutions. There was the Constitution that was ratified in 1789, the original Constitution. And then there's the second Constitution that was transformed by the struggle over slavery and Reconstruction, which produced the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And those 3 amendments aren't just amendments to the Constitution. In the view of many scholars, they change the whole nature of the American state. They empower the federal government to do all sorts of things that the federal government couldn't do before. They really create a new constitution.
And one thing is to protect, the federal government protects people from the actions of the state.
Absolutely, absolutely. And particularly the states themselves, yes.
Right.
So what's interesting about Thomas is that unlike many conservatives, he believes that there are, in fact, 2 constitutions. And even more interesting is that he accepts the idea that African Americans really did transform this second Constitution and the role of slavery and all the rest of it was central to it. So this is all, from the point of comparing him with other conservatives, with white conservatives, marks him as very different. But the last part of this is where things get a little wonky, because at the heart of that black Constitution that was created by Reconstruction, he thinks the most important freedom, the most important liberty that African Americans achieved is the right to bear arms. That this was central to the battle over emancipation, and it was central to the effort to ward off Jim Crow. And so he, at the heart of this black Constitution for him is a black man wielding a shotgun, protecting his family from other white people. And this is, again, something that many people don't know about because they haven't read his opinions, but that's there. So that's the black Constitution. Mm-hmm. The white Constitution is something we were just talking about a second ago, really, which is a much bleaker version. It's the original Constitution. And there, what Thomas seems to be arguing is, if you empower the states, not limit the states, but empower the states, particularly with their power to punish, to imprison, to police, and so forth, black men in the black community will essentially, in his view, get their act together and will become like what he perceives and remembers his grandfather being. And he believes there's been a whole generation, 2 generations now, 3, of black men who got lost in
If you only had old Jim Crow back.
Exactly, exactly, yeah.
Interesting. What did you discover?
That's one word for it.
What did you discover while researching the book that surprised you?
Well, first of all of this incredible consciousness about race, that did surprise me because it's very much not in keeping with how other conservatives. Secondly, this black nationalist past that he had as a much younger man and how it bleeds into the present. And I think those 2 things in particular, and I should finally say, his opinions, and I really urge people to read his opinions. Supreme Court opinions, I teach constitutional law, tend to be fairly dry affairs, very impersonal. Thomas's opinions are not like that. There is so much personality that's stamped upon them. Once you start reading them, you know you're reading a Thomas opinion. And they are very disturbing. This is not a book that's a defense of his vision at all, because they're very disturbing. But there is a logic and an integrity to them. And as I say in the conclusion of the book, in a way, Thomas has a claim on representing where America is today with its extraordinary hostility around questions of race, with the rise of guns and so forth.
Thomas is in his 28th year on the Supreme Court. He is, in fact, the court's longest serving justice. I didn't know that. What do you think is going to be his lasting imprint on the court?
I think he will come to be seen as one of the major spokespersons of the right turn of the court, which we're now really beginning to see. It's been slowly happening over many years, but I think he will look back as somebody who laid down the markers long before many other justices went there, and that people ultimately followed him.
We've got about a minute and a half left. Tell me what you want readers to take away from your book.
2 things. One is an awareness of Thomas's views, that these are much more complicated than we've been led to believe, and I would like people to engage with those views. But the second is that I think Thomas speaks for America in a way that we don't realize, and it's something I was alluding to a second ago. Namely, when he talks about the persistence of racism, the impossibility of overcoming racism, the centrality of gun violence. Now, he takes views on this that I think many on the left and liberals don't endorse, but it reflects, I think, in many ways, the Trumpian moment that we're in. And he offers us a window into what America has become.
I'm afraid we're out of time. I'd like to thank Corey Robin, Professor of Political Science at Brooklyn College and the CUNY Graduate Center, and author of The Enigma of Clarence Thomas, for joining me today. The book is published by the Metropolitan Books imprint of Henry Holt & Company and is available online and in bookstores. For 1 to 1 and the City University of New York, I'm Sheryl McCarthy.